So it's going to record my desktop, which is totally cool because it has all the windows and we all can be seen here in our little pictures. And you'll see how Google tends to make choices about who's going to be shown. So you are all being highlighted through Google's algorithms somehow. I don't know. I actually think it's all based on who it picks up on the microphone. So just briefly, so I just wanted to make sure that thank you all for like chiming in on the Slack. I actually have the Slack open, so I do want to try something really fun. I want you all to open the Slack and to chime in as we're talking onto the Slack. Literally type in as we're talking. Any reactions you have, thoughts you have. So we're going to have like the conversation we have on the video here and then chime in on the Slack as you see fit through the conversation. Like if somebody's talking and you have a thought, just jump right on it. The other thing I wanted to just remind everybody, the timeline. I love what's happening. Don't feel like you need to be totally like organized and clean on it. Get messy on that thing. I actually think it's too organized right now. Like, get messier. The pictures can be bigger. They can start overlapping. Don't feel like you need to be orderly in there. It's already orderly because it's pretty much a spreadsheet. So, that keeps it in control. So before we start the conversation going, and again, we're chiming in on the Slack. We're going to try this and see what happens. I also wanted to just briefly talk a little bit in terms sort of like the graphic design history. And then we're going to jump a little bit from what the strands that happened last week that people were starting to talk about. And some of you chimed in that universality kicked in a lot. The universal situation kicked in. But I just wanted to cover it a little bit because part of what we're doing is sort of like jumping into graphic design in terms of the history. And one of the things that I want you to keep in mind is, for example, the term graphic design, and I'm looking at this brief timeline that I made. The term graphic design didn't show up until 1922. Keep that in mind. And that was William Addison Dwiggins, who was a designer, very famous type designer in the US. And he coined it in terms of this emerging field, profession, that was something that was not fine arts. So before that, what we call graphic design were primarily fine artists who were experimenting. The funny thing about it is, of course, a lot of the theory of graphic design, a lot of the ideas come from fine arts, or they were fine artists. Some of these people would not consider themselves designers per se. They would consider themselves painters, poets, things like that. So keep that in mind, and also keep in mind that a lot of what we're dealing with is sort of a reaction to the technology, how much of graphic design, or what we call graphic design, was shifted by specific technologies. So, for example, the idea of Gutenberg in the 1450s inventing the letterpress. So we went from handwriting, which had been the way that a lot of communication was developed, into actually, if we go back to that, verbal communication, storytelling, then handwriting, then calligraphy. Keep in mind who can actually write at that time, who was actually designing, primarily monks in monasteries or religious priests and so forth and so on. Gutenberg invents the letterpress, the technology explodes, and then the letterpress takes us through the 1450s, primarily all the way up. Let's see, probably till like the Industrial Revolution in the 1900s. It's the next time that the technology explodes and forces the field to shift. And you can argue that now we're in one of those again, where the technology has pushed the field out of its comfort zone. So, as we're talking, think about what's happened. So a lot of the technologies and the ideas that get developed in the 1900s, 10s, 20s, 30s in the Bauhaus, how does that manifest itself now? How do those ideas that were primarily made for paper, for designing on paper, two-dimensional, how do they manifest themselves in our world today, which is so digital and in which this little digital paper. I'm picking up our phone, but my camera's like not liking me right now for some reason. If you pick up your phone, that's that, the screen, that's the paper, right? Or your computer. So, keep that in mind as we're having conversations. So, with that in mind, the question that I laid here for this week was think about how so much of graphic design theories have been played out as typographic form and experiment, in particular in the early 19th century. What is your perspective on this experiment, and how do you think they continue to inform design in our modern cultures? So again, a lot of these ideas manifested themselves in posters, books, forms that don't necessarily. We all love books, we all love posters, but is that what a lot of us do anyway anymore? Right? Like, think about that. What's the modern version of the poster? What's the modern version of a book? Yes, you still make books. They're beautiful. Lots of us love making them. So I want you to think about that. Again, constantly thinking that what we're discussing is sort of thinking about how the theory and the history and the technology and all of this sort of coalesces into what you end up doing as a designer today. Does that make sense? So who wants to start chiming in? And now we have several essays that I ask you to read. So there's the Crystal Goblet. There's also Typophoto by Mahalanaji, the New Typography. There's the Ladislav Sutnar piece. There is the Graphic Design History from a Global Perspective, the Wee Cho article. So who wants to chime in? And again, as we're talking in the written discussion, you can chime in on the Slack. If people are talking and you're like, oh, there's a thought, you can let it be a sort of stream of consciousness. So don't worry about making sense. Cool. So what hit at you from the readings this week? Any particular ideas that sort of sprung out to you?
Well, I will say that I was thinking about going out of your comfort zone when reading the end of Sutnar's piece.
Mm-hmm.
And his last tenet, I guess, was saying, and the creative forces at work will find their basic validity in terms of the human values of sincerity, honesty, and the belief in the meaningfulness of one's work. But this last part, I think, is about going out of your comfort zone in people who disregard material advantages for the sake of new experiments that will make future developments possible. I think that's really, that's a universal statement of progress.
Right. In the countries that again, the progress, if we're talking about progress in terms of, for example, technology, right? How that plays that out. I actually never had read this essay till a few months ago. And then I found it and I was like, oh my God, how come I've never read that essay? I found it really interesting.
It is really interesting, and the way it's laid out is fascinating too.
Yeah, but he's also talking about it's sort of like this idea of faster, produce faster, distribute faster, communicate faster. An article that was written in 1961, right? When the computers and that technology was not totally fully flushed out, or was not accessible as it is today, where you're starting to think. But it's also like an extension of the Industrial Revolution, which was faster. It also harkens back to, so for example, the Futurists and Marinetti, which if you want to read is in the theory book, right? Marinetti, the Futurist, it's all machines. We love machines. We want machines. Machines are going to do it all. And, at that time, it sort of okay. But in 1961, he's thinking ahead. Also, Sutnar, if you read the little blurb, he was kind of responsible for this idea of sort of corporate design. He's the one that pushed for that. So I always start thinking, this idea of corporate, but also coming out of it as this fine arts approach, right? What do other people think? Thoughts, responses, or other things that hit at you?
interesting how all of the different designers had this like fascination and like almost fixation on communication and how to purify it, how to clarify it, how to make it as fast as possible. And I thought that was really compelling.
Right.
It kind of reminds me of what we're going through today, you know, with like the new technology, the advances in how we receive communication. We're kind of in a similar maybe spot of innovation.
Right. But are we clarifying? Because there's a lot. I mean, you picked up on a really good point, Kelsey. Right. Like, there's a lot of conversations about like clarification, legibility, understanding. Like, is that where we, does that translate to, for example, white screens with like black letters on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the sense, is that what you're translating it to, or how are you translating it, or other people too?
Sorry. No. I guess I just meant we're in like a similar place of not sure.
Okay.
Like new technology, like when they were writing this, they're trying to like keep up with the new technology of the time, the print, the typo, photo, and I feel like it's similar today where technology just keeps coming out, and I'm not sure. To answer your question, I'm not sure if it's
right.
more clarity.
So you're right. So you're linking the fact that at these times in the 20s in particular, they weren't quite sure what was going to happen. They knew that there was this stuff, this technology, the Industrial Revolution, but they didn't quite know how to work with it fully yet, right? Like they hadn't understood the full dimensions of it all, right? That's what you're sort of saying, right? And we're kind of in the same like time frame here where we don't really know the complete powers of the technology we have, which makes sense. Like one of the things that I think it's in, again, this idea that a lot of these people, for example, Mahalanaji and Jan Schichold were pretty much artists before they were designers, right? Like Mahalanaji, I don't even know if, he's not at the Bauhaus, but I don't know that Mahalanaji, like I've certainly seen a big Mahalanaji, exhibitions and stuff, and it's mostly like fine arts, considered fine arts. So I don't know if he's considered a designer, but the idea of the typo photo, like, and you probably got this from when you read it, it's like super influential piece because anytime you find a picture next to a text, that's what he's talking about. This merging of these two different forms and actually working together to tell a story. The idea that there's different layers, right? That these layers can work together rather than the separating things. That might be too reductive in many ways, but it gives a dimension, right? Or this idea, he says like Gutenberg and letterpress was kind of like linear, and all of a sudden once you started to get to the idea of a typo photo, you start to get dimension, and there's dimensionality and depth instead of just sort of linear lines, which I found really... He also talks about like typography as an expression of modern life. So I wonder what you thought, like those of you that are in type or you're taking type or you deal with type all the time, is like, what does type look like to us nowadays, right? Like if you start thinking as a designer, what does typography look like today? Like what is it supposed to look like?
Yeah, I kind of want to chime in and
go for it.
Tag on to what Kelsey was saying about sort of, what, and like what you were saying, Ramon, is like, what does typography look like today? And with digital technology, maybe you could argue that we're in kind of sort of a new typography. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of typography in sort of a digital space is, kind of a hyper extension of a lot of the principles that came out of new typography, particularly as like these modular units.
Right.
Right, where we're distinguishing visual hierarchy that's predetermined by the content, titles and sections. Typographic content is consumed at a pace that, has never before been seen, that I think considerations for that typography go into digital design. Why is sans serif overwhelmingly recommended to be, type of choice for body copy? Don't make your paragraphs too long because no one will read them. Keep them extremely digestible, like absurdly digestible.
Right.
And I think a lot of that stuff is, kind of emergent. And there's all kinds of tools today with digital technology that you didn't have with print, even in new typography, like analytics or monitoring where people's eyes are going on the screen and stuff like that. And I think eventually a lot of that will contribute to an additional paradigm shift in digital typography.
So again, think about that the root and the basis of typography is based on two-dimensional ideas pretty much from 500 years ago from letterpress. So how does that manifest in when we're working on a computer when you're talking about tools that can actually do a lot of things that we didn't even think about 100 years ago, 25 years ago? How about that, right? Like 25 years ago, we did not realize we were going to have an app that would dictate a lot of how we consume information, or like the printed word, Twitter, 140 characters. Aside from what you can think of Twitter, right? In politically, but like how people like supposedly can digest long paragraphs. Like, what the hell happened? Part of it is, don't you think, like, it's very difficult to sit on a screen all day long and read, right? Like, it's moving, so you're constantly like, oh my god, I can't see things, right?
And I think our attention spans just become so limited because content is so readily available that we're so quick to just like be like, I'm bored now, on to the next thing that's hopefully cooler or more interesting, and like
the pace of life becomes faster, right?
Yeah, and I think you make a good point. Like, what are they like? Can we read a long paragraph anymore? Like, what are the implications of that on our perceptions of literacy, reading levels, and attention spans?
I'm just playing. What is our perception of literacy, right?
Yeah.
That makes me think about what the like material has on that effect. Like if I had a book that was made out of paper, like resources that got it printed, maybe that has some validity in making me want to like stay with the paragraph longer versus like just looking at your phone and you can swipe and to the next thing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a super interesting conversation in terms of like, again, like how the technology pushes us, and again, because I think you're linking of like the Industrial Revolution, all this technology that was coming at us, and all the changes that they were not able to perceive, and how they sort of got played out for about like 80 years, and now we get to this new place where like all of a sudden everything's shifted again. And then we have to rethink the paradigms, right? Like, because you can then argue then, okay, so all of these like modernism, a lot of the strands of modernism, then you can say, well, they become a reaction to dealing with what the Industrial Revolution brought out. So whatever we have now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, what are we going to call it? Right now we can just call it X, right? Because we don't know. Like, and it's shifting every day. Because this technology, you can argue, and you all chime in, is like, this technology is being developed much faster than the Industrial Revolution, I feel like, right? Like, don't you all think that, like, it's just faster? like,
kind of adapting to, like, our needs and, I mean, what we want and kind of, like, what functions today, it seems like. Like, I mean, having things at the tips of our fingertips is kind of what we're used to since computers have been invented, but so books and stuff back then would be the resource that people had. So whatever, like typography would be, or calligraphy even, people would be writing it out because that's what they had as far as resources. So whatever function for them would be, that's how things have like progressed, it seems.
Right.
Yeah, I want to add that nowadays that typography is influenced by the radio and movies, and it makes a lot of like multi-dimensional media possible to like mix with the text. So so they could just mix with image.
Nice. Yeah. There's so much of like I just keep thinking as we're talking, like how much, because it's really funny. Technology is so pervasive that sometimes I think it's so pervasive we forget that it's there now. And as you're all saying these, I'm like, oh God, wait, right. Ugh, oh, okay, wait a minute. Even though we're like right now, like this is a technological conversation because we're letting this technology that was developed like allow us to have a conversation in a class even though we're all in different places. But like how pervasive it is. So I wonder if as designers, do we have to be hyper aware so we can design for it, or with intention that it's going to be used different from a book, for example, right? That the engagement is totally different, the way it's used is totally different, the form is totally different. It's actually even more like it has its own mind, like like it's all these algorithms that are designed, but we can't really control the way we could control a book or pages, right? Like the pacing of it, you get bored, like like Nick, you just said, you get bored, you just move on to the next thing really quickly. Whereas in a book, you would have to page through and you paste it and all of that. So it's really when you start thinking as a designer that your headspace has to go in a different space than if you were designing a poster. As much fun as designing a poster is, you may need to rethink how that all manifests itself, right? If that makes sense.
Oh,
Go
I
for
do-
it.
I really liked Beatrice Wade's essay, and I think that she summed up the idea of typography working for the content and
Right.
and working to have the humans ingesting the content, having it be compelling, or rather just defer to the content.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that there's a moment right now where that's not really being upheld, maybe because of this like explosion of technology. I feel like there's a lot of design that's like based around manipulating the human, as opposed to as opposed to upholding the content itself. And I just think that's a really interesting potential shift that we might be in the midst of.
Right.
And one that we have responsibility to, maybe redirect as new designers.
Right. So a few things about Beatrice Ward. This is probably, have any of you read this piece before, like in type class? It's usually a type class essay that's given. And it's one of those essays that a lot of people have really knee-jerk reactions to, that they kind of want to either throw it out or they love it, one of the two. There's never usually a middle ground to this essay. And I'll tell you why. So just one thing that you said just right now about that. So just before we get to Wardrobe, so in the new typography, John Schickold, who, again, he went into the Bauhaus, and John Schickold has this book called The New Typography. It's the whole book that he wrote, which is translated, and I can send you guys a PDF of it. I actually found a PDF of the whole book, so I'll send it to you afterwards, so you can look at it. And he developed this, and he was influenced by the Stijl in the Netherlands, and then the constructivism, and this whole idea in it about typography today, that asymmetry was modern, symmetry was ancient or sort of classical, and trying to figure out what the typography of the day was, and creating this system that could like literally express what typography looked like at that time. One of the interesting things that I just realized about John Schickold is that he escaped a concentration camp, which I did not know, and he went back to Switzerland and kind of disavowed this whole book that he had written.
Yeah, that was shocking.
I had never realized that. I was still like, what? Because he saw in the system fascism in it, this control, which you just talked about, this idea of this sort of control. And I think a lot of design, of course, is about controlling and dictating and creating hierarchies that dictate how we engage with things. And that, when you said that, just like I was thinking about Schickold, and I was like, huh. So, like, he built such a rigid system and he went through this personal experience that was incredibly traumatic, and he realized sort of like, wait, my job is not to shackle somebody with things. My job is perhaps to make entry points for them to engage with this.
Right, and have it be like a transparent thing that people can interact with differently based on where they're coming from.
Right. So here's the critique of the Crystal Goblet. Okay, so that idea of the transparency. So Beatrice Warder was completely like into the idea of functionalism, creating work for the masses. She spoke a lot. Keep in mind that this underneath this is the subtitle is or why printing should be invisible. So she was talking to printers, not to designers, because at that point there was no graphic design yet, per se. And there was, if you look at the timeline, she was in England. One of the things that the idea of this is, the idea of the invisible is that you, the designer, are completely invisible. That you should never be seen, that you should never be understood. We don't know anything. You should just, it's totally perfect. You never see the glass. When you're drinking the wine, the glass should be invisible. It's just a container. Now, where that becomes problematic is when you hit postmodernism in the 90s, where they're saying, well, that's impossible because you're a human being, so you are processing this content. So somehow you have to be part of it. You can't pull yourself out of it. The decisions you make as a designer immediately tipped off to what you're thinking about, how you're how you are engaging with that content and trying to generate a piece of work. So, like that idea of being invisible could be interesting. Of course, there's context, right? So, for example, if you're typesetting a novel, you can argue that the novelist does not want you to be in the middle between the narrative and the reader, right? So you have to, there's certain forms. But maybe there is, designers still make gestures. The typeface you select, the type size that it uses, how much space it has, how accessible you make a reading or not, right? You can also be working with a novelist that's like, I wrote this narrative, I want you to design it, and literally design it. And there's many narratives and books that you can look into that designers have worked with writers directly. One of them that is in particular, if you think of Alice in Wonderland, if you've ever encountered Alice, Lewis Carroll himself designed the book, kind of. Because there's moments when the type goes crazy, and it's because he designed that way, right? Tristan Shandy, if you've ever read that book or you've ever seen it, it's a really old book, and that was designed. There's like 30 versions of it because every 10 years some design studio gets that job to redo it, and it's meant to be designed because the narrative jumps. And then there's jumps that as a designer you have to do. So you literally have to visualize the jumps that the narrative takes. There's a really ridiculous movie. It's just a nightmare of a book. So it's a nightmare of a movie. It makes no sense. I wonder if the idea of, do you think that it is possible for you as a designer to totally be transparent and not be seen? Or what do you think about that?
I think it's kind contradictory when they say you should be objective, not be emotional. But sometimes, usually when the manager asks you to work on the project, they always say be creative, bring your ideas. So bring your ideas basically little bit subjective. So it's contradictory. If you want to be transparent, then you don't really have that much idea to put in it.
Right. I mean, it's many ways. If they're asking you to bring your ideas, then you're already saying, well, I can't be transparent. You're asking me to be part of it.
Yeah.
Or if you're just being asked to typeset, again, keep in mind that the subtitle of this essay is Printing Should Be Invisible. So she's talking about typesetters, which, by the way, is a job that disappeared about 15 years ago, right? The Mac showed up, desktop publishing showed up, and all those typesetters lost their jobs, most of them. In design, right? In design, killed them because there was this whole other group of people that will typeset the type for you, and they made it invisible. So when you were just a designer coming up with ideas, but they would typeset. So the language has also changed, right? So the titles of the jobs have changed, the language has changed, the context has changed, the technology has changed. So there's all this, change everywhere. So how do you hang yourself in what area of the field do you hang yourself? Or do you not have to worry about that? And you can make that decision later. Or you just become one of those designers that you have your hands everywhere and you just love it, right? So you're very flexible in terms of like, I do this and this and this and this. And you find lots of examples of designers right now that are working a lot, right? Like, some of us work and teach and do a bunch of other things that we consider design because the field has expanded. So it's no longer just designing books and posters and websites and things like that. It's actually expanded to, in many ways, a lot of graphic designers don't even use the word graphic. They just talk design because they're not designing paper or screen. They're designing fabric. They're designing furniture. Right, they're designing buildings. Oh my God, those graphic designers become architects.
Or like user experience, right? That's like the hottest thing now.
That's the hottest thing. You got
it. Where did that come from? Like, and that's not necessarily they're a designer, quote unquote, but what are they designing that's necessarily there's almost nothing tangible about user experience design. I mean, sure, maybe a prototype here and there, but they're talking about the experience for the user. And what does that mean? So,
and a lot of that is psychology 101. So if you go to if you've taken Psych 101 and you start doing UI UX, you start to realize that there's certain patterns that humans do. So you're trying to maximize that to generate experience that something can sort of pretend, but just back to your point, are actually controlling you, right?
I kind of think that Jan, how do you pronounce his last name?
Jan Schickel.
Schickel. I feel like he would be a UX designer.
Oh my God, how much does, I'm just typing a question, go ahead.
I've also, in trying to bridge the two ideas of being objective and subjective, I've thought a lot about how when I read about musicians who've written successful pop songs, I feel like they're always talking about their lyrics being kind of vague enough so that other people can put their own feelings into them, but also there's a certain amount of themselves in the lyrics,
right?
And I think that's that kind of is how graphic design could be too. It's you do bring your creative stuff to it, but other people should be able to bring their own experiences to experiencing it.
So it's a lot of art works that way, right? You can think fine art works that way, you can think music works that way, you can think literature works that way, where writers will mask things, right? And sometimes you don't even know it's about them. They've created characters that are sort of masked. So, there is a sense that the work is very specific yet open enough to actually have people come at it from different points of view, right? So if what we're saying is that, okay, so we're making work that's open enough for everybody, then what happens to that infamous universal word? What happens there, right? I'm going back to the strand of the conversation, and actually one of the things that when Hui Choi talks about in that piece about graphic design from a global perspective, starting to think about how that narrative of universal design, that idea of universality, and it, in many ways is an idea that comes out of modernism, that doesn't fully work. Because in order for, what you're saying is we want to have an object or a thing or a design that actually has many entry points, not just one, right? So think about that idea, right? How you can make a design that actually, like a piece of music, like a novel, where so many people can pick it up and have their own engagement with it. Think about how tricky that is to do and how you can do it. What tactics do you develop? What methodologies do you use? What is it that you do in your compositions? What kind of typography do you use? do you use a grid or do you not use a grid? How do you design a website using UI, UX in a way that actually is not sort of like just relying on style and and trends to actually make something that actually engages with people or actually feels like it's not controlling you, but it's actually allowing you to engage with it. Because that's ultimately the challenge for all of us, right? Is to not just think about these ideas, but also think about how we implement these into our own practice, into the work we make. And that becomes a challenge, just so you know, for all of us, not just for you guys in school, but for me too, because I'm like, oh my God, what happens to the stuff I read and these methods and all of that? What do I do with that? Like, I can't just, how do I translate that to work for today? Does that make sense?
That reminds me of in Pedro Oliveira's essay, the one that you have, or the cheat sheet, the last line kind of I thought was super impactful and kind of reminds you of what that you're saying. If all design is ideological, as Dune says, do take that statement seriously. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I mean it's really sort of it's attempting to push the ideas of the field and what's been written down and what's been codified and what's been canonized, and pushing it past or sort of tipping it on its side a little bit, so that it opens the door, right? It's what you guys are talking about. It's not locked down as one point, but there's many entry points, and actually context has a lot to do with how you decide to use it or not use it, or which door you want to use, right? So depending on the context of what you're developing, who's going to use it, why, how, all of that, you can start making decisions. But the important thing, I think, for the purposes of class is for you all to think about how these ideas of, Beatrice Wardle, being transparent and, all these technical issues and ideas of, control and ideas of universality, how that plays in your own work, right? Does that mean, for example, certain choices in typography, right? Also, Nick, you mentioned the sans serif. Originally, sans serifs were called grotesque because they were known as being ugly, right? So when they were made, all the serif typefaces that were around that everybody loved, when these sans serifs showed up, everybody's called them grotesque for that reason. They were ugly. They were imperfect. They were not supposed to be legible. They were horrible. They looked awkward. They look weird. And look where we are now. Like a sans serif, like we're in a sans serif party right now. Everybody wants a sans serif, like the cool little rounded sans serif, right? The other thing that I thought was one point that I wanted to bring in the last paragraph of Beatrice Wardle's essay in The Crystal Goblet, and this is something that I just picked up on this time that I read it, just so you know. So just so you know, when you go back to read things you read a million times and you pick up new things. So she says, right, in the last paragraph, she says, there is nothing simple or dull in achieving the transparent page. Vulgar ostentation is twice as easy as discipline. When you realize that ugly typography never effaces itself, you will be able to capture beauty as the wise men capture happiness by aiming at something else. The stunt typographer, that phrase, I'm like, oh, I know a lot of those. There's a ton of those on the web right now. I see them all the time. The stunt typographer learns the fickleness of rich men who hate to read. Not for them are long breaths held over serif and kern. They will not appreciate your splitting of hair spaces. Nobody, save the other craftsmen, will appreciate half your skill. The idea of being a stunt typographer cracks me up because I feel like that hits at style, that hits at trend, right? Like are you really learning a craft or are you just learning a trend, right? Like, why do we all need to use Futura, right? Like, or why does it all need to be blue or green, right? RGB green, whatever. So, I was thinking really that idea of being a stunt designer, a trendy designer, when people start telling you trends. But also start thinking that what you're like, how all of this again encapsulates into the work you make. Any thoughts about that?
I think it's like a form versus function, or I liked thinking about form, function, and then one of them said flow. Was
Mhm.
that Sitnar
I think it
too?
was Sutner who
Yeah, I
said the
think so.
flow.
Oh, I thought I've heard of form versus form and function in terms of architecture, but I'd never heard of flow before. And that was a new, like, that's an interesting extra piece. Oh yeah, he said,
Yeah.
well, or you have it?
Yeah, oh no, go ahead. You're reading it.
You go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, because I thought I had heard of form versus function before too, with form being secondary, but in this case it's actually tertiary, where he says flow is the quality that satisfies logical needs by providing a space-time sequence relationship of elements. And yeah, I think that's fascinating because I think that plays into, it follows function where you're still championing communication over any sort of aesthetic concern.
Hunting.
Yeah, I mean, what's really, you guys are talking about flow, and I'm thinking of movement and energy. It takes me back to the futurists with their obsession with movement and energy. And I link it to that, which feels really interesting because if you start thinking how if the flow, it also sounds more musical. It also sounds, there's a lot of other like things that pop into my head in things of thinking of flow. I think the form follows function can sometimes get tricky, or function follows form, and then you get into these like sayings that became really big during modernism that some people now are like, I don't know about that, right?
Yeah, and I think flow is actually, I mean, this just occurred to me, but you could consider that as sort of modeling natural systems like we've talked about. We did kind of into that even a little bit towards the end of digital design, but I think they're talking about like Euclid's geometry or of the natural sciences, where our perceptions of everything around us is completely linear. Time, our lives or whatever, and of course typography reflects that as well. So I think being conscious of that model,
Right.
You can bring that into design too.
Right. The other thing, one thing that, and I'm making this link because I'm looking at the Wen Yu Chu article, and this idea of you guys talked earlier about the many doors, the many entry points, which in many ways design has created like one entry point, and now we're thinking about, so like how do we debunk that and make many entry points, starting to think about how a lot of design history and design itself has focused a lot on individual people, like lionizing people, versus in comparison to, for example, thinking of the larger ideas behind the work, and at the expense of like broader like larger context of design rather than just a person. We've just, there's a lot of argument about, and you'll read an essay later on, that design history, Tibor Kalman talks about design history being a bunch of pictures of people and posters, like individual people and posters, and that's it, right? There is no larger discussion of the context under which things were created and how, for example, in a lot of cultures in the world, things are communal, and design sort of forgot that, and which is, I think, is something really interesting that we're getting in this trying to wrestle with the technology. We're back to teams. So a lot of UI UX, it's in teams. You're designing in teams. You're not designing on your own. So you're trying to create this idea of a larger communal cultures of design rather than single individual. The single individual that has so much power. So that's one of those interesting things. But it also, if I'm maybe I'm making a link, you guys can disagree with me, but this idea of the many entry points, sort of a more, I'm thinking of flow, which is sort of a fabulous image because it's really active if you think about it. Like there's so many ways to do flow. So you could take that idea and play it out in one of your projects, by the way, there you go. Right? Like how do you generate flow? Starting to think about opening it up so that we have other cultures, other ways of thinking, other potential ideas from other thinkers that we haven't thought about in design before, and how that happens. But that also leaves it open for you to actually start thinking, wait a minute, I can mine ideas from other places that are now graphic design and bring that into graphic design. And they don't have to come from fine art just necessarily. Maybe they come from music, right? Or maybe they come from literature. Maybe they come from biology, right? Maybe they come from something that I really love, cooking, I don't know. So again, it goes back to, in many ways, it's not as transparent as Beatrice Waters said. In many ways, you start to think, wait, I have to, like, what do I like? And how is my entry point into this thing? So it's kind of a way to sort of like wrap around. And also that gets at a little bit of starting to think about, right now I'm really into sort of figuring out like how we expand graphic design from this sort of canon that it's embedded in, because I don't think it literally included everybody. So for example, one of the things that I've been reading about is this idea of how graphic design theory and ideas have just been planted in other places and just sort of copied over. And this idea that other cultures, other languages were just sort of creating imitations of a Latin alphabet, even when their own languages don't subscribe to the form and the structure and the rules of a Latin alphabet. So starting to think how this idea of flow and many entry points, how that opens up for a lot of all those conversations to happen, a lot of that design to happen that's not necessarily relying on codified systems of, the international style, for example. So there's a lot of really, really good sort of things for you to think about here. And again, we're jumping from like the history from like the 1900s. We're going to like linearly go down towards that today in a few weeks. But really to start thinking about as you're doing this is like how this manifests for you. So take little notes of like, what do I do with my design? Like, what can I do to shift it into this mode, right? Or maybe you don't. Maybe you're like, maybe I want to redefine what that term means as a designer for the work I'm making, or for the work I'm interested in making. Even if it's at work, because some of you are working, and one of the things that happens with this is you're working, and this sometimes clashes with what you're hearing at work, right? You can nod your heads yes or no if you, because like I know
100% yes.
Right, like this sometimes clashes with an art director or whoever the person talking to you about doing the work is. Partly because in design, in our culture, we don't have time for this. There's no time for you to think.
Well, it's like you were saying, Sydney, your project managers will come to you and say, bring your ideas, be creative, but I'm not, I mean, that's just such a throwaway statement that you hear all the time from, project managers and directors and things like that, or whatever. And I'm not sure, I would argue that more often than not, they're not necessarily aware of what that means because it's so vague and ambiguous. And it's not really considering even the needs of the project or even best practices per se. It's just
Right.
like, do your best, designer person, design away. It's like, okay, well, what the hell does that mean?
I think lots of times because the manager doesn't have ideas. That's why they
Right.
hire a designer to make idea for them so they could look good.
Right, yeah.
But do you think managers ever know any of this? Project managers, in my estimation, and this is going to be horrible, are failed English majors. In my experience, they're just failed English majors. They have no concept, and sometimes they behave like they know that they know things, and you look at them, you're like, you have no clue what the hell you're talking about. Right? So there's one of those things. But so yeah, you are hired because you know things. But one of the things that maybe we all need to do is just take a step back and really think about, okay, what are the gestures that I do? So when that project manager talks to me about bring your ideas, you already have a little box of ideas in the back of your head. And certain things you're like, it could be as simple as can we not use that typeface for this project? Can we use something else? I have this other typeface that actually talks better about that than using Helvetica because you guys just, for no reason, right? So you could come up with those tactics for yourself. What are the little gestures as a designer that you make that sort of start to talk about these ideas that you are interested in talking about? And nobody else may know that, but you get that project back, you get the book back, you get that website, and you're like, oh my God, I love it. It has a different life than if you had not actually done that little tweak to it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Other thoughts as we wrap this is really good. Like, I'm super excited. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Last week was really good too. It was just unfortunate that the recording didn't work. So I'm double duty today in case, so I can post it. But the idea of flow, I really like that you guys picked up on that. And you guys totally did, because I totally underlined it, but it didn't pop into my head. The idea of flow, the idea of how technology is sort of in many ways chaotic right now, so we're all reacting to it, and we don't know its limits. I think that's really great. I'm interested in sort of, as we talk further, is how you all how these ideas manifest in your work, in what you do in other classes, in what you do at work, how you tweak it, how you tweak systems that you have to use for making work to actually engage with these discussions, with these ideas. Does that make sense? Cool. So, all right. So next week you are all chiming in the discussion for next week. Group 1 goes to the discussion. You all have a break, and I don't see you guys until the 3rd of October. We're gonna be full swing fall. Are you all in Minneapolis, by the way?
I am.
Who's in Minneapolis? And where's everybody else?
I'm in Denver.
You're in Denver.
I'm in New York and Philly and Connecticut. My life is kind of crazy right now.
It's all right. I was in New York and Philadelphia till the summer, and now I'm in Providence. There you go.
Oh, that's cool. Too bad you're not in those areas now.
No, I had to move up to Providence.
Providence seems cool.
Providence is cool. It's tiny. I'm from New York, so Providence is super tiny, right? Shin, where are you at? Are you in Minneapolis?
I'm in Chicago. I don't know who you're talking to.
Chicago. Okay. So we're cool. Great. Awesome. Well, we're all East Coast, Midwest. Nick, is that Western time technically? No, Mountain time.
Mountain time, yeah.
You're in Mountain time, so you're 2 hours behind us. Wait,
Yeah.
2 hours behind me, an hour behind.
8:30 over here.
It's what time is it right now?
It's only 8:30.
Right, okay. Well, there you go. So you have a few more hours to hang out tonight.
Yeah.
Awesome.
There's leftover pizza waiting for me, so.
All right, hey, fun. So chime into the timeline, keep adding things to it. Remember that you need to incorporate yourself in there. Whatever dates are important for you about yourself in there, in that timeline. And be messier. Get that thing messy. Get really messy and fun. You can, play with the design, maybe you do bigger type. Maybe the pictures get bigger. You don't have to rely on it all being tiny type. Make it big.
Oh, can I just say one thing that was making me nervous, was when adding columns or rows, it affects everything in a way that seems rude or something.
Have fun. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Yeah, just no. If you see if it bumps a picture out, you can put the picture back. So you have complete control of it because you can edit it. So just no, have fun. Make it messier. If you need to add, it'll bump things over. That's fine. It's an Excel spreadsheet. Make a bump over. It's meant to be messy, so don't rely on it. History is very messy. It's not as clean as we try to make it be. So let's make it messy. I know I always forget about that. So make it messy. Don't be so nice about it. I'm looking at it and I kind of want to make some pictures bigger. which is so great. I'm like, ooh, yeah, let's make some pictures need to be bigger on here. Some of these pictures are really nice. So play with it a little more. So yeah, awesome. All right. Well, great chatting with all of you. Next week you are all on Slack. Also, feel free that you don't have to make big long narratives in Slack. You can literally chime in with questions. You can chime in with like, wait, I have a question about that. What do you mean by that? So that it starts to feel more like a conversation. You don't have to feel like you need to write narratives all the time. So, feel free to be more free form with it. Cool? Awesome. Well, you all have a good night. Nice chatting.
You too.
Thanks for the awesome conversation. Think through all this stuff, and we'll keep talking through the semester. All right. Have a good night.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.